A wild Mustang crew chained in the middle of nowhere, starving, exhausted, with no way to escape. Knew how long he had been suffering, but one thing was certain. His spirit was far from broken when a lone man discovered him and made the impossible decision to set them free. He never expected what would happen next. What this Mustang did in return will leave you speechless. Jack Carter had seen a lot in his 45 years. He had seen men break wild horses, watched them turn untamed spirits into nothing more than obedient shadows of their former selves. That was why he had walked away from that life. He had sworn never to get involved again. But fate had other plans. It started as a routine ride through the Wyoming wilderness. The crisp autumn wind cutting through the valley, rustling the golden leaves. His old bay mare Dusty moved at a steady pace beneath him, hooves pressing into the damp earth after the previous night's rain. Jack was out there for peace, solitude. He didn't want reminders of his past, but then he saw it. At first it looked like a pile of rags caught in a dead tree branch, the colors blending with the earth, but then the rags moved. Jack pulled Dusty to a stop. His sharp blue eyes narrowed. What the hell was that? Then came the sound, a clanking of metal, followed by a harsh, panicked snort. Jack's stomach clenched. He knew that sound change. She slid off Dusty in one fluid motion, dropping the reins loosely over a low-hanging branch. His boots crunched against the dirt as she moved closer, careful not to make any sudden noises. And then he saw him, a wild Mustang, his rich brown coat streaked with mud and sweat, his mane tangled and wild falling over his dark, terrified eyes. He was massive, taller than most Mustangs. Jack had seen his muscles barely concealed beneath the layer of dirt and exhaustion. But what stood out the most were the chains, thick, rusted iron wrapped tightly around his front legs, cutting into his flesh, keeping him tethered to an old splintered wooden post hammered into the ground. The Mustang's nostrils flared, his sides sheaving with ragged breath, his ears pinned so tightly against this head that Jack knew this horse wasn't just scared, he was fighting for his life. Jack clenched his jaw. Who the hell would do this? He took another slow step forward. The Mustang jerked violently, hooves scraping against the ground, muscles coiling. Jack stopped. Easy, boy. The Mustang snorted hard, his brown eyes flashing with defiance despite his exhaustion, despite the chains digging into his skin. He wasn't broken yet. Jack exhaled, steadying himself. He had seen horses in worse conditions. He had seen them give up, but this one was still fighting, and Jack wasn't about to let that go to waste. Jack Carter had been around wild horses long enough to know one simple truth: they would rather die fighting than live in chains. And this Mustang was no exception. Jack took another cautious step forward, keeping his hands visible, his stance calm. He wasn't there to hurt them. The Mustang didn't know that yet, but he would. Easy, boy, Jack murmured. The Mustang threw his head back, yanking at the rusted iron chains wrapped around his front legs. The metal clanked loudly, rattling against the wooden post that kept them prisoner. His deep brown coat was streaked with his flanks rising and falling in heavy, panicked breath. His hooves scraped at the dirt, desperate for escape. Jack's gut twisted. The way the chains dug into the Mustang's flesh told him one thing: this wasn't recent. Someone had left this horse to suffer. Jack gritted his teeth. Hadn't know who. Hadn't this, but Heschel wasn't about to let them win. He slowly crouched, his boots pressing into damp earth, inspecting the chains, thick, rusted, twisted tight. Whoever had done this hadn't wanted the horse to break free on his own. Jack reached for his knife. The Mustang snorted sharply, muscles tensing. Easy, fella. Jack kept voice low, steady. The Mustang watched him, her spin, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to snap. Jack could see it in his eyes, pure survival instinct. This was at the moment of truth. Jack slowly extended his hand, holding the knife away from the horse. I'm going to cut you loose, all right? The Mustang's sears flicked forward, then back again. Jack wasn't sure how long he stayed there, crouched in the mud, staring at the animal in front of him. Maybe a minute, maybe 10 time, didn't matter right now. Then in a single fluid motion, Jack reached out and sliced through the first chain. The Mustang reared. It happened so just a flash of hooves, the sharp crack of iron snapping, the sheer force of muscle and desperation exploding at tons. Jack threw himself backward, hitting the ground hard, just as one of the Mustang's front hooves swung dangerously close to his chest. The horses screeched, half stumbling as his weight shifted forward. Jack barely had time to react before bang, the rotting wooden post snapped in half. Stang collapsed forward, his massive body crashing onto the dirt with a weight of exhaustion. Chains rattled, hooves kicked, dust exploded into the air. Jack rolled onto his feet, ignoring the ache in his ribs. She didn't care that he'd nearly been crushed. He cared about one thing: was the Mustang still alive through the thick dust? Jack saw him. The horse was down, but not for long. With a deep guttural grunt, the Mustang kicked out his legs, forcing himself upright. The staggered, his massive body trembling, but it wasn't broken, not yet. Jack's breath hitched. The chains were still tangled around the Mustang's legs, but now they were loose enough for him to break free. The Horse realized it too, and then he bolted. Jack didn't even have time to react 1 second. The Mustang was standing in front of him. Then next, he was gone, galloping into the dense wilderness, chains dragging behind him, disappearing between the trees. Jack stood breathing hard, watching as the last trace of the Mustang vanished into the wild, and then silence. Jack exhaled sharply, wiping the sweat and dirt from his face. Well, that was one hell of a thank you. Jack Carter stood there, hands on his knees, breathing hard, watching the last trace of the Mustang disappear into the wild. He had done what he came to do. He had freed him. That should have been enough, but Jack's eyes flicked downward to the broken chain. Shaft buried in the dirt, pieces of rusted irons still lay at his feet, snapped where the Mustang had fought for his life. And then he thought about the other half of those chains, the one still dragging behind the horse. Asher ran blindly into the forest. Jack muttered a curse under his breath. This wasn't over-grabbed. Dusty's reins swinging up into the saddle in one smooth motion, his old, and flicked a near back at him, sensing his tension. Jack exhaled, rubbing her neck. "Girl, I know this ain't smart." Dusty huffed, shifting her weight. Jack had spent years breaking Mustangs, teaching them to trust. But this wasn't around Penora Ranch. This was the wild. That Mustang didn't how him a damn thing still. Jack pressed his boots lightly into Dusty's sides, and the mare moved forward, following the disturbed trail of hoofprints in the mud. Tracking a wild Mustang was like chasing a ghost. Most people wouldn't even try. Hell, most wouldn't even notice the signs. But Jack had spent half his life reading the land. The Mustang had taken off fast, leaving deep gouges in the damp soil where his hooves had dug in. The trail cut straight through the trees, snapping small branches in his path. But then the track started weaving, zigzagging the way a horse does when it's no trunning in a straight panic anymore, buttering to shake something off. Jack frowned. The chains, that damn metal, was still clanking behind him, probably spooking him even more. Jack clicked his tongue, urging Dusty into a steady lope. The tracks were fresh. If he hurried, he could catch up at first. It was just the rustling of leaves, the distant rush of wind through the valley. But then clank. Jack stiffened. There it was again, the sharp, unmistakable clanking of iron on rock had pulled Dusty to a stop. Fart pounding. The Mustang was close. Jack dismounted, silently dropping the reins, knowing Dusty wouldn't wander. His boots pressed into the wet ground as she moved forward, carefully pushing through the trees, and then he saw him. Thunder stood frozen in a shallow creek, his massive brown body drenched in sweat, sides sheaving with exhaustion, but it wasn't running anymore, because he couldn't. The chain had caught on a fallen logie, anking tight around his front legs. Every time he tried to pull away, Themetail dug deeper. Jack felt this chest tighten. The Mustang was trapped again, but this time Jack wasn't the enemy. The horse's ears twitched violently, his tails wishing in agitation, but he didn't rear or thrash like before. He was too tired. Now Jack crouched low, keeping his movements slow. Guess we're not done yet. The thunder flicked a near toward him. Jack took a breath, steadying himself. This was it. One wrong move, and the would either bolt or finally decide to trust him. Jack Carter had done a lot of stupid things in his life, walking straight toward a wild Mustang trapped in chains for this time. This might be the dumbest. Thunder stood in the shallow creek, his massive brown body soaked with sweat, his powerful legs trembling under his weight. But this time he wasn't running, not because he trusted Jack, but because he couldn't. The chains wrapped around his front legs had caught on a fallen tree, yanking tight whenever he tried to move. Every time he struggled, the rusted iron bit deeper into his skin. Jack exhaled. This had to end now. Jack took a slow step forward, his hands soap invisible. Thunder snorted harder, twitching his muscles, flexing with tension. Jack stayed calm, his deep blue eyes locked onto the Mustangs. It wasn't about strength anymore. It was about who would back down first. Jack crouched, keeping his movements slow, easy. Big Eye, we've been through this already. Thunder watched him, nostrils flaring. Jack could see it now, the exhaustion behind the fear. The Mustang was fighting two battles, one against the chains and one against his own instincts. Jack reached for his knife, his fingers closing around the handle. Thunder flinched. Jack froze, his breath slow, controlled. Not going to hurt. You muttered. The Mustang's dark ease darted to the blade, then back to Jack. Jack made the first cut. The knife sliced through the old rope, tangled with the chains, loosening the tension around Thunder's legs. The Mustangs huffled uneasily, testing the newslack and the restraints. Jack took a slow, deep breath. He moved for the final link of iron, the one deepest into Thunder's skin. Thunder stiffened. Jack's fingers brushed the metal, and then Thunder made his choice. The Mustang exhaled sharply, not as Nord of fear, but of acceptance. Jack didn't was Teasekin. He twisted the chain's snap. The rusted metal broke loose. The last remnants of the Mustang's captivity fell away, crashing into the creek below for the first time. And who knew how long Thunder was free? Jack didn't move, didn't breathe. The Mustang stood perfectly still. The only sound was the soft trickling of the creek, the rustling of leaves in the wind. Jack had expected Thunder to run again, to take off without looking back, but instead the Mustang just stood there, his dark eyes locked onto Jack's. Jack could have sworn something shifted in that moment. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. Thunder gave one final huff, then slowly turned and walked away, not bolting note in fear, just leaving Jack sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow. He exhaled, well, guess that's that. And then Thunder did something Jack never expected. Jack Carter had freed the Mustang. That should have been the end of it. But as Jack sat in the dirt, catching his breath, something strange happened. Thunder didn't leave. He had turned, stepped into the tree, his massive brown body blending into the shadows. But then it paused. Jack's breath hitched. The Mustang turned his head slightly, his dark eyes flicking back toward Jack. And then he came back. Jack didn't move, didn't dare breathe. The Mustang stepped forward, slow, deliberate. His muscles rippled beneath his coat, his man shifting in the wind. He was still wild, still untamed, but right now he was choosing to stay. Jack stood slowly, careful not to startle him. Thunder watched him, his ears twitching, nostrils flaring, but they didn't step back. Jack had spent years breaking horses, stamming them, training them to trust, that had seen every kind of reaction, but never this. All right, Big-Eye, Jack murmured. What now? Thunder huffed, shifting his weight. His hooves pressed into the damp ground, but he didn't bolt. Jack took one careful step forward. Thunder stayed still. Jack reached slowly, extending his sized hand toward the Mustang's muzzle. Thunder's ears twitched back for a second. Jack thought they'd made a mistake, a cake. But then the Mustang lowered his head just a fraction, just enough. Jack's fingers brushed against Thunder's muzzle, feeling the warmth of his breath, the coarse texture of his fury, and for the first time ever the Mustang allowed it. Jack let out his low breath. He had never planned for this. He had freed Thunder because it was the right thing to do, but this horse, this wild, untamed soul, had just made a decision of his own. He could leave at any moment, but instead he stayed. Jack knew better than to push his luck. He took his low step back, dropping his hand. Thunder blinked, nostrils flaring, his tails wishing ons before he finally turned and walked away again. But this time he didn't run. Jack watched him go, disappearing into the trees, his massive frame blending into the golden light of the late afternoon. And this time, Jack didn't feel like he was watching a stranger disappear into the wild. He was watching an old friend go home. Jack Carter had spent his whole life believing wild horses didn't owe anyone a damn thing. That was the way it was supposed to be. You freed them, you let them go, and if I were lucky, they never looked back. But Thunder had, and Jack wasn't sure how to feel about that. The sun had started its slow descent behind the Wyoming mountains. The air was crisp and quiet, the kind of evening where nothing should have felt out of place. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had made it back to his horse, Dusty, who had been patiently waiting near the creek, her hand through her man, exhaling as she looked toward the trees where Thunder had disappeared. You're thinking too much, Jack muttered to himself. He had done what he's taught to do. The horse was free. That should have been the end of it. But then a sound cut through the silence. Jack froze. It was faint at first, a low, distant rustling, some moving fast through the brush. Jack's gutting heightened wolves. It wasn't uncommon. He had seen signs of them earlier, but it had been too focused on Thunder's chains to worry about it. Now his instinct screamed at him. He wasn't alone out there. Dusty shifted beneath him, ears flicking toward the sound. Jack reached for his rifle, eyes narrowing as she scanned the tree line. Then something burst through the trees. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Thunder, but there wasn't alone behind him. Weaving through the underbrush were three wolves, lean, hungry, and the closing in fast. Jack didn't have time to think. He kicked Dusty forward, moving fast, heart pounding in his chest. But Thunder, he wasn't running in blind panic. No, he was fighting. The Mustang skidded into the clearing, hooves kicking up dirt. Ashy spun to vase. His pursuers, his massive brown body moved with precision, muscles flexing a shearer down his hind legs, letting out a piercing, bone chilling scream. Jack had heard Mustangs call out before, but never like this. This wasn't a cry of fear. This was a warning. The wolves' hesitated, ears flattened, but they weren't backing down yet. Their yellow eyes flicked between Thunder and Jack, calculating, waiting for a weakness. Jack raised his rifle. One shot in the air should be enough, but before he could pull the trigger, Thunder moved first. Jack had seen stallions defend their herds before. He had seen them fight, kick, and charge when it meant protecting their own, but he had never seen a wild Mustang do it for a man. Thunder lunged toward the nearest wolf, teeth bared, his powerful hooves slamming into the ground just inches from the predator's head. The wolf yelped, spinning back. Jack fired a single warning shot into the air. The sound ripped through the valley, echoing off the cliffs. That was all it took. The wolf sterned and vanishing back into the trees, the underbrush rustling in their wake. Silence. Thunder stood, the rebreathing hard, his flanks rising and falling, his ears still pinned back in defense. Jack lowered his rifle, staring. The Mustang had just protected him. Thunder's darkies met this. Jack didn't know how long they stood there. Maybe a skin, maybe a lifetime. Then Theth gave a final huff, shaking his man, and just like that he turned and walked away, not in fear, not in panic. Butte in absolute control. Jack let out his low breath, wiping the sweat from his brow. Well, I'll be damned. Jack Carter had spent his life believing that wild horses belonged to noon, They were meant to run free. That was why he had let Thunder go. That was why he had never expected to see him again. But now Jack's on the wooden porch of his cabin, watching the sunset spill golden light over the rolling hills. Dusty was tied up near the old fence, hairs twitching as the cool evening breezes settled in, and standing just beyond the tree line watching him was Thunder. Jack didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. The Mustang stood still as a statue, his brown coat shimmering in the fading light, his muscles relaxed but strong. Jack could tell Thunder wasn't there by accident. Jack exhaled. Didn't expect to see you again. Thunder's ears flicked forward. Jack leaned back in his chair, rubbing the stubble on his jaw. You're free. You know no one's going to stop you. Thunder huffed softly, shifting his weight. His dark eyes were locked on Jack, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with something else entirely. Jack had seen plenty of horses in his time. He had seen them broken, beaten, trained, and tamed. But this was different. Thunder wasn't looking at them as a master. He was looking at them as an equal. Jack swallowed hard. Hell, maybe he had been wrong about Mustangs. Maybe some did remember. Jack stood slowly, keeping his movements calm and easy. Thunder didn't flinch, didn't bolt. They just watched. Jack took a step forward. Well, big guy. Thunder exhaled sharply, shaking his man. Then he took a step forward too. Jack felt tightness in his chest. This was it. Thunder was choosing to stay, not as a captured horse, not as had a mad animal, but as something else entirely, a friend. Jack let out his low breath, stepping back toward the porch. Suit yourself, big guy. Thunder stayed right where he was, and for the first time in his life, Jack realized maybe some wild things were never meant to be tamed. Maybe some were just meant to stay willed right by your side as the last light of day faded. Jack sat back in his chair. The Mustang stood just beyond the fence watching over him. Neither of them moved, neither of them needed to, because some bonds don't need words. Some bonds don't need saddles, fences, or some bonds just exist. And that was enough. This was a story about trust, freedom, and an unspoken connection between a man and a wild horse. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who has powerful stories of courage and friendship, because sometimes the best things in life can never be tamed.